up, everyone? Welcome back to Moonlight Game Devs, the podcast where game developers share the story behind their game and the lessons learned with their fellow developers. Today I had a chat with Richard East. He's the solo developer of Frontline Zed, a zombie survival game, and he shared what it was like to jump straight into full-time indie without even really knowing that much about game development. So, he took a big risk and it ended up paying off. His game did well. And, we analyzed some of the aspects there, some of the lessons learned, especially what it was like to work with freelancers and the business side, which I think is not that talked about a lot in the sort of developer community. So, I hope you guys enjoy it and find it as useful as, I found. What's up, Richard? Welcome to the show.
Hey, Mark. Good to finally speak to you. It's been a few weeks since we'd planned the interview, so I'm really happy to speak to you now.
Yeah, it's awesome that you took the time. You're another interview guest from Australia, I believe. Or are you there right now? I think you mentioned you're traveling Europe as well.
That's my background in Melbourne, but that city is under really heavy lockdown at the moment. And I only went back there just to see some family members and help them out. And I was lucky I was able to escape back to Europe, because Europe is where I've been living the past 4 years. So I'm in Lviv in Western Ukraine right now.
Oh, beautiful, beautiful. Oh, I guess that segues nicely into kind of asking you about, your background. Like, you created a game called Frontline Zed. I hope I said that correctly. I just want to chat about like how you got started in the the game development industry and that backstory there.
So Frontline Zed's an indie game that's been out for about a year now. My background is not really traditional in the industry. It's my first title, and I don't have any formal games industry experience. My background is in IT generally, in telecommunications specifically. So I'd been working in Australia for about 10 years in the telecommunications industry, managing IT products. And eventually I hit a point where I was lucky enough to get an EU passport from my grandmother. And I also reached the point where I wanted to just release my own product and start my own business and be responsible for my own creations.
Mm.
And also to broaden my abilities as well. Because when you're working in big companies, you're normally working on products that have been around for a long time, and you've got to fit in with hundreds of other people, and you often don't have an opportunity to create your own things.
Yeah.
So it seemed like it was a good combination of factors that I was able to move overseas, to start my own business, and to do it in an industry that I'm passionate about and have been interested in for a long time, which is in the games industry. And it's an industry which I think is growing, and it's positioned well for the future.
Oh yeah, thank you for sharing that. Like, did you when you said you wanted to start your own business and move as well? Was your kind of first intention to just go straight up full time on this business?
That was a really big decision to make. Some people suggested to me to continue working full time, but then also in my spare time to continue to basically investigate and work on game development. Um, and I know some other developers have done that, like David Weller from the First Tree. He was able to pull that off. But
Yeah.
I thought it would be better to just take a clean break, just take some time off. I was able to save up some money, and to just focus all my time on learning game tools, learning production process, learning as much as I could for myself, and just putting all of my time into it.
Awesome. Yeah, it's interesting that you actually, took that risk and um, didn't even really know any game development, I guess, before you took that job. I mean, it looks like, it did pay off. So let's have a chat about kind of the game idea that you had there. So Frontline Zed, maybe I think, you as a developer can probably describe it best to the audience and kind of give us a picture of what the gameplay is like.
So Frontline Zed, it's currently available on both PC and Nintendo Switch. It's an homage to the old school Flash games of about 10 years ago. Basically, the position is that you're one of the few sole survivors in post-zombie apocalypse America, and your role is to defend your fortified position by night and collect weapons and conduct repairs by day. And if you survive long enough making your way through America, then you can eventually be rescued. So if you see any of the screenshots, you'll pretty much immediately get the idea behind the gameplay, which is kind of like a guilty pleasure tower defense, starting off with pistols and without any other fellow survivors, but gradually building up your arsenal, building up traps and other survivors that you fight with, and just taking out increasingly greater waves of zombies and zombies um, that have body armor and so on. So the gameplay is fairly simple, but it's definitely a guilty pleasure for players, and it's something that you can kind of relax and burn off a bit of steam with playing.
Yeah, I played it myself and I really enjoyed it. It really reminded me of a game called Last Stand, which used to be really popular back in the Flash days. I think it was on like Congregate. Was that actually a game that you you knew and were kind of inspired by? Because the theme, the gameplay, they were really similar.
Flash games of that era have definitely been a big inspiration, and the top-down shooter genre at the moment, it's really all about a lot of Twitch gameplay and Twitch reflexes. So I wanted something that people could relax a little bit more when they're playing, just focus on shooting and on killing and building up their arsenal, and on things like weapon management and time management. So a lot of those Flash games, they had really good, enjoyable gameplay, but they didn't have the modern 3D graphics that people come to expect now in 2020 or 2019 when the game released. So um, I spent a lot of time getting that gameplay right and really making it feel as kind of visceral as possible, with blood effects and shooting and so on, but also updating
Mhm.
all the graphics to kind of be what you'd expect for a 3D top-down game in this era.
Yeah, and like I kind of want to know about, how you got to that game idea because you just kind of you quit your job. Did you already have the game idea before you did that, or was it something that you kind of came up with during that learning and iteration process?
That's a good point. And I think this is something that it's you have to be flexible when you're coming up with these individual ideas. I went through definitely a learning process with that. Initially, when I did decide to do this full time, my plan was to create a top down World War II strategy game with similar visuals to how Frontline Zed eventually turned out, but basically with a completely different theme, being in World War II, and kind of a broader strategy focus rather than on the tactical action of Frontline Zed. Um, but basically, I realized that the that was just a concept that at the point when I started it was just beyond my capabilities, and I needed to um, take the scope down a bit and just focus on something simpler. And a zombie game, top-down shooter, provided that basis. It enabled me to create something simpler, and then also to have a foundation to build on and to expand and add more features as I continue development.
That's a great point because I think, especially for a beginner, kind of a trap there to build something that is kind of way out of your scope and skill level. So that's very good that you actually caught that early and were able to pivot into something a little bit, I guess, more like you said, kind of more scalable. A game like a Frontline Z, you can kind of define, how does the player start. There's a very basic gameplay loop, but you can add layers of depth by adding items or levels whenever you need to. What was that process for you in terms of getting started? How did you get started with the actual game and the learning process there?
I struggled a bit initially, to be honest. So the engine is Unity 2017 LTS. Um, I think, like most players, I originally, or like most developers, I spent as much time as I could just experimenting with the engine, understanding its capabilities, understanding what my personal capabilities were. Um, I guess in terms of my technical background, I understand the basics of programming, but I'm not an expert programmer. So I was comfortable, for example, taking, um, or initially how I began really making progress with development was to first experiment with Unity templates of the top-down shooter, top-down kind of action genre, and
Mhm.
basically just picking them apart, dissecting them, understand how they operated, understand how the projects were built in Unity, understanding what the limitations of these templates were. Um, and that proved to be really beneficial because even though I didn't really use the templates in the final product, that basically everything was pretty much created from scratch, um, it still allowed me to really quickly understand what Unity was basically capable of and what I would have to create from scratch.
Yeah, can you talk us through some of those things, those limitations that you maybe noticed, or you know, opportunities that you saw just from exploring the templates, and how that maybe also affected kind of your game idea as well?
One of the biggest limitations was, I guess, the broader limitation of a lot of these templates is that they're designed to provide maybe 100 different features, but you personally for your own project might only need two or three. And that means that the template is going to have a lot of overhead. It might not really be designed for you. They're designed for mass appeal, these templates. Um, Specifically, one of the biggest issues was really around zombies, in terms of their functionality, the AI behavior, the animation and character controller systems, um, as well as blood effects and optimization. And as you might imagine for a zombie game, the zombies are really the stars of the show. And it's important to really just get that gameplay loop, like you said, of shooting zombies. That's kind of the fundamental basis of the game. To get that to be really flawless, and that meant things like, I guess, to come back to the idea of the template, like could the template handle um, 3D blood particles when you shoot the zombie? Can it handle the decal system of blood pools on the ground? What kind of AI behavior can you rely on for the zombies? And then, of course, you've got the player itself, that's on a completely different system. So it's really kind of getting to a point where I could have a prototype ready and I could understand, okay, this is a fun thing to play, and it basically gives me a pathway to continue development with. But it also means that, okay, I know that these systems XYZ, they need to be created from scratch, so I need to ensure that I've got the time and money to spend on getting them in place. Um, the alternative would have been, if I didn't have any of these templates, I would have just had to experiment with everything, and it would have been really time consuming and difficult to go through that prototype stage without that.
Yeah, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Using that template to get a feel for the kind of mechanics you can build there, and basically just picking out the parts that you need. I want to talk a little bit about, you just mentioned the two main resources that most game developers have at their disposal, which is time and money. How long did it kind of take you to make that first prototype? How much time did it take you, and what was the kind of process there?
I guess when somebody speaks of their first title, you always, and particularly if they don't come from a game development background, you have to take into account time spent to understand the whole production process, understand Unity, understand all the development. So I think definitely for this first title, if I was to recreate this with the knowledge that I've got now, which I think is probably the fair kind of reference point, I think that to do all this, it's in terms of the full-time effort was about a year and a half. But if you take into
Yeah.
account the amount of time to understand Unity and game development, as well as some other things that applied to me, like moving all the way across the world and just getting to grips with life in another region. Basically, in hindsight, I'd pretty comfortably say that the amount of time required from me was about a year and a half full time. And in terms of the budget that was necessary, um, I think this could have been even further optimized based on my understanding now. But all up, if I'm looking at things like freelancers, external artwork, licensing for the engine, for sound, things like company setup and creation, web hosting, version control, so pretty much everything. It'll be roughly about 20,000 US dollars. So it's a reasonable investment of time, to make a year and a half and 20,000. Um, but so far, it's proven successful, and on PC and on Switch, the investment has paid off basically.
Yeah, yeah. Thanks so much for sharing. Being very transparent there with your budget and the time that you used. This is also for the full game, right? Not the prototype.
Yep, that's for the whole thing. Yep. I think that would definitely vary as well, that amount, depending on your capabilities. The biggest cost for me was working with freelance programmers, because basically the decision that I had, and I guess this applies to any of the freelancers that I worked with, was if it would take me a month to do something, to go through the process of learning some specific aspect of development, but I could hire a freelancer to do it in 2 or 3 days, I would go with the freelancer, because it just made more sense to hire the experts for really specific jobs and to learn from them where I could, and to keep production rolling like that.
Honestly, I think that's such a great advice if you are planning to treat game development as a business, because you want to think about min maxing money versus time. I always think about this as well. Is I see a lot of game developers, they're trying to learn everything, trying to do everything. They're trying to make great art, code their game, and then do the sound as well and the music as well. But realistically, if you could just spend a little bit of money from your day job, and it isn't something that's like your hobby where maybe you don't want to spend money, or you just want to make it kind of your own thing, you're doing it more for the art, then you can just save so much effort and time, and just be so much more efficient by doing exactly what you did there. Can you kind of tell us a little bit about what kind of things did you in particular commonly find you needed to outsource? Because I don't know, after all that learning that you did, what you kind of focused on? Were you trying to maybe you mentioned Unity there, trying to get good at Unity, but did you also maybe dabble with creating art, or where did your kind of skill focus lie?
I think that's a good point, because I didn't really mention what were the things that I worked on. So, um, in terms of the whole project, I was responsible. I guess in terms of the main areas that I was responsible for was all of the design of the game design, all of the level design, all of the sound design, all of the whole art direction, play testing, community management, marketing, advertising, bug testing, project management, version control. The areas that I probably had the least to do with, probably the major area that I did outsource was Unity development programming, or specifically Unity programming. So I worked with two talented freelancers, one Chance Avery from the United States, and another Joe Chatfield from the UK. And it might sound like, okay, if there's something you're not familiar with in Unity, some aspect of programming where you can just hire a freelance programmer to do it for you, but it's really quite far from the truth, because if I look at the amount of documentation that I wrote when I was working with freelancers, it's probably almost 100 pages of documentation. Um,
Wow.
because
Yeah.
when you hire a freelancer, you need to really know specifically what problem is that you want them to solve. You want to present them probably some kind of a direction, on how they can solve the problem, and then you need to evaluate their work, and you need to take into account like what's a reasonable amount of time for them to spend on the problem, what's budget that they have to solve it. So even if you're not an expert programmer, you still you you need to still understand programming, because you need to understand what you're getting. And even when someone delivers a result to you, for example, let's say that one of the programmers chance, um, the typical job would be basically, if I, for example, the blood system, the blood pool system from Frontline Zed, it's based on a technical asset called dynamic decals, which you can get on the Unity store. Um, and the typical job would be, for example, integrating that asset into the game, um, so that it is functional with all of the other systems inside the game, that it works in a certain way. Well, of course, you've got to document, how does that blood work? What does it look like? You've got to provide the blood textures. Um, you've basically got to set up everything possible so that that freelancer can just come in, really easily understand what they need to do, and as easily as possible do their job basically, and then for you to evaluate it at the end.
That's fantastic advice there, because I think, like you said, even if you don't plan to code a lot, you plan to hire a bunch of developers. The communication part is so important in any business. I think even if you have full-time employees, you need to be able to convey your vision, make sure that your freelancers understand what they actually need to do. I guess in your case, and also, yeah, like you said, I guess kind of assess the quality of the code, be able to tell, does this freelancer even know what they're kind of doing, and all of these things all really like play a huge role. Um, I guess you mentioned there that you got like a lot of help with the code. What about like art? Did you mainly use Unity assets for that, or also some freelance?
I use the mix of both. So I guess when you're building a game like this to a certain budget and to a certain price point, so the price point is $11.99 and launched with a 17% discount. Definitely you have to be mindful of how much certain things are going to cost in terms of time and money. Um, and I think it makes sense to use. I mean, when you're looking at the Unity store, I suppose you've got a mixture of technical assets, which are just basically in the background, and no customer's really going to recognize any of them because they're integrated into your game so specifically. And then you've got other things like 3D models and user interface and sound. And I think, to be really honest, if you're able to present an appealing visual design for the game and create something that looks unique, even if some of the individual assets are not unique. For example, some of the zombies, Frontline Zed, are from zombie packs in the Unity store. I've not had a single customer ever mention that. It's never been raised by anybody at all. And I think if you look at
Good.
the screenshots for the game, it probably helps that it's a top-down game, so the individual characters are a bit smaller, but also there's more of an emphasis on just the classic aspects of art creation, like the form, the color, and the composition. So I really I was aware of the fact that the majority of the assets were not unique to Frontline Zed. But with that said, there were some assets that I did have created specifically. And that's the barricades in the game. So if you see a screenshot, you'll see the hastily created barricade that divides the player on the left from the zombies on the right. So even if I wanted to buy them, you can't buy them because they're such unique items. They're animated, they have destruction animations. Um, they were created specifically for Frontline Set, as well as a few specific zombies. So armored zombies, security zombies, hazmat zombies, they were created specifically for Frontline Set. Um, I think the other good thing about working with asset store assets at the beginning is just that it enables you to get started really quickly and easily. Um, and you know what you're getting. I mean, if you buy a zombie from an asset store, you know that it's going to be rigged in a certain way. It might be animated. Maybe it's got different levels of detail that you can use. It kind of provides a point of reference for you that if you do want to create a lot more custom assets in the future, that at least you have something to base them against.
Yeah, totally. I think the concern a lot of game developers have when they're creating assets is their game being called out for being an asset flip or whatever. But I think the chances of that are pretty low. The majority of consumers never look at the Unity asset store, and even then, they probably don't play enough of the same type of games for the same assets to show up over and over. Yeah, you need to play like a bunch of indie games.
Yeah, I think it's really just often when people say something is an asset flip, really what they mean is that it's just very low quality art, not really inspired. That fundamentally from a visual perspective, it just doesn't look very good. So I think, yeah, as long as you're presenting something which is fundamentally visually appealing and interesting, then it's not going to be a problem.
I think one of the things that kind of lead to that, and it's something that I noticed you did really well, is when you combine some asset packs, it can easily be that they just don't look like they fit together and things look disconnected. But I think that in your case, like you said, like the barricades, they fit really nicely to, for example, the style of the zombie models, both color wise and also like atmospherically, and in the detail and art style of the models. So Was this something that you actually told the artist to do, use as a reference point, make sure they are consistent with the other assets that you were using?
Definitely. And I've actually, I guess we can talk about this in a little bit more detail later on, but that's one of the big learnings that I've had from Frontline Zed is that when you're working with freelancers or even when you're working with anybody, they could be your partner, you really need to have seed references, something for creators to base their work on and then expand upon. And that's something that I guess it's one of the other reasons for the visual style of Frontline Z is because when you look at the screenshots, you can kind of, it's a little bit stylized in terms of the lighting and the atmospheric effects and the volumetric lighting and the blood and everything. But fundamentally, it's still realistic. All of the items, the 3D items in the game world and the characters, they're all to realistic scale and realistic texturing, realistic rendering. So that was also a big boost as well. Um, Basically, by having the real world as a reference point, I guess that would be a difficulty if you're creating a heavily stylized game, like maybe a 2D or a low poly game. Then things become a lot more difficult because you've got to create a really precise art world, and you'd have to create that world just for your game. Whereas Frontline said I was able to rely more on the real world, I suppose you'd say.
Yeah, I'm not noticing the same thing. It's kind of a concern that I have with my game as well, which is a little bit more stylized. Definitely using some assets there, but if I ever work with a freelancer, I need to basically help the freelancer get into the kind of art style and figure it out. Whereas your freelancers would presumably just have a much easier job. There's no specific style regimen. Like, I don't know, for example, in a stylized game, you'd have certain color palette that the freelancer needs to learn first and take in. But in your case, like you said, it's already almost possible to confine it using, like you said, the lighting, for example, to give it a realistic look, and then use the lighting to give that certain atmosphere. Because in these realistic kind of games, there's not too much of a texture, color palette, or limitation there.
I definitely agree. And I think that that is one of the fundamental abilities that, for example, if you're working as a solo developer, that's really, nowadays, I think in the current market, that's probably the greatest skill set that you can have really is being very confident with the art direction. Uh, One of the specific reasons for that is that, for example, I spent a huge amount of time in Frontline Z on the lighting and post-processing effects. It's one of those things that, for example, when you're adjusting the lighting of a specific scene, it might just take days in some instances to get the lighting right and to make everything that's in that scene look appealing. Um, you might be, working 10, 12 hours a day trying to get that to a specific vision that's inside your head. And those are the sort of things which I think you need to just do yourself as one of the core developers in the team. Like maybe you're working with a team of one or two or three people, but one of those people on the team needs to really have that art vision inside their head and is willing to put in the hours to get there. Um, if you're working with freelancers, then they can do it, but if you're paying someone, $20, $30 an hour, you just got to be more mindful of how long some of these things might take.
I think it's also important to have someone who is consistent, even if, for example, if you're hiring someone to be, the artist expert. I think it is still great to have, a consistent vision in mind as the creator, because, like you said, what if the freelancer suddenly, is no longer able to work for you, for example, or that they're just taking ages to come up with this their own vision, and that just doesn't seem like that viable to me personally. Also based on the arguments you just made there. I want to talk a little bit about kind of the solo developer lifestyle that you live there, and kind of, I guess, the psychological aspects of it, of keeping yourself accountable to work on your game, given that it is your presumably in the future main source of income, and having that pressure there. What was kind of your daily schedule, and how did your day in your life kind of look like during that time?
I'll admit that at the beginning I didn't really get it right, but eventually I have figured out now how to get it right. So maybe I can talk about some of the difficulties and then some of the solutions. So you're definitely right that when you're working as solo developer, it is difficult to particularly if you're working on your first project and if you don't have experience in the games industry, there's just so much. It seems like a huge cliff that's in front of you. So many things to do, and it's really hard to prioritize and to understand what you need to work on first. So it's very daunting. I think what proved to be most beneficial is really just establishing a good foundation, good fundamentals, so that you can build a good work ethic on top of that. Um, so that would mean, for example, if you're working from home, you want to ensure that you've got a good office environment, that you've got a separate office from the rest of your house. Um, Maybe alternatively, you're working in a co-working space and you want to ensure that you've got a good space that's conducive to work and that's quiet. It's definitely tough at the beginning because there's a lot to do, and it's can seem like for so long you're not making any progress, and it's easy to get disenchanted with the idea. I think that's where the idea also of the templates comes in, because when you download them and access them, you know that they're not going to be perfect. They're not going to produce the end result, but at least you can see something that's running and operational in front of you, and it enables you to imagine that pathway forward in your head. So basically, the irony is as well that now that Frontline Z is actually out on two platforms, and that the revenue is coming in, and I'm doing this completely full time without any problems now, um, it is a lot easier to keep working and to work on a second title and to keep producing. Because I know that I've done before, and there's people who are interested in the second title, and I know what has to be done. Um, so I think part of it is just kind of trying to divide up. Firstly, establishing for yourself a good working environment, because it is difficult to create its knowledge work and its creative work. So you need to be happy in the space that you're in. And you really need to try to put forward a plan and a project plan that enables you to get from where you are and subdivides as many tasks as you can think of. You can just work steadily through, and that you've got the end result in your mind.
Yeah, thanks so much for sharing that, because I think those are really, great pieces of advice. Also, of course, from your own experience as someone who's actually done it, walked the walk.
I'd add one more thing though, and I'd say if you have the opportunity not to be a solo developer, like you could work with one other person, I would definitely look at that. I think that you can probably produce greater than the sum of two people's output if you work with another person. Of course, you've got the extra complexity of working with another person. Maybe they don't want to spend the same amount of time as you do, and all the other organizational things to consider. Um, but for the future, for me, once, maybe not immediately, but maybe sometime later next year, it would be good to physically work with another person, either in sharing the revenue together as a partnership, or hiring an employee. So it is difficult to be a solo developer. There's no getting around that. And if you have the opportunity to work with someone else, then I would take it. It's a good match.
Yeah, thanks for being so honest about, being a solo developer. I think it is really tough because you also have nobody to bounce back ideas off, for example, which I think is really valuable, especially if you have someone who's just passionate about you, about the project. And yeah, that's kind of what I've been facing as well. Been thinking about getting someone onto the team. So yeah, thanks for sharing that as well. Yeah, I want to talk about one thing, and that is, I saw on Reddit that your game is doing really well on Switch. And I think one of the challenges for developers is, especially solo developers or smaller developers, is each kind of platform that you adds its own challenges. They've got their own achievement systems, own SDKs and things you need to consider. We've seen the battle with Fortnite right now, and Apple stores and Google stores. But what was your experience like porting your game to Switch? Was it difficult, a challenge, or?
So with the Frontline Z version on Switch, I partnered up with a publisher called Forever Entertainment. They contacted me a few weeks before Frontline Z was due to release on PC, and they liked what they saw, and they thought it would be a good match for Nintendo Switch. I
Mhm.
continued to develop the game on PC, released the game, that went well. Continued to add some updates based on customer requests, and based on a roadmap. And then towards the end of development, um, well, Basically, as the development continued, once I reached a certain point where I was pretty happy with the PC version, I sent them the complete Unity project. Um, and the company Forever Entertainment is quite large. They've got, I believe, maybe a staff of over 50 people, probably more. And basically, they're experts at porting games to Nintendo Switch. It's their day job. They've got dozens of programmers and developers working on it. So they were able to take the project from me and evaluate it in terms of what would need to be changed and optimized for Nintendo Switch. Um, they came up with a list of maybe 10 major items. Then I went through the list, and they also suggested on some of the things that could be done to actually optimize them. So I went through that list of things and picked out the items that I thought would be beneficial for the PC version to fix or to optimize. And then I left them the things that would be just specific to Nintendo Switch. Um, and that actually proved to work really well because, for example, one of the major bottlenecks in terms of performance on PC at release was the barricades. They were created, well, they were animated in Houdini using kind of a semi-custom alembic player that I think I found on a Japanese guy's GitHub, and it's amazing that it even worked in the game because it's a really precise destruction sequence that happens when the zombies destroy the barricade. Um, so that was pointed out as a really big performance bottleneck, and I was basically able to hire a freelancer, Corey Richards from the UK, and within just actually a small amount of time, he was able to take the Houdini reference destruction sequence and turn that into a traditionally rigged and animated um, object, as well as he also ran some general optimization on it. Um, so that proved to be a big performance boost on PC, and it was necessary for Switch as well. Yeah, basically the fundamentals of it was that I was contacted by a publisher, and that we worked together to optimize it, and then they were ultimately responsible for the certification process and so on to release it on Nintendo Switch.
That's awesome. Did they do any other kind of services for you? Did they fund parts of the game or do a little bit of advertising, or did you do most of the marketing yourself?
They basically financed the development. They financed the porting costs onto PC. Onto Nintendo Switch. Um, I didn't. There weren't any upfront amounts involved for that. They also benefit basically from just the economy of scale. I think they're the number one independent publisher on Nintendo Switch. So they know what they're doing with the platform. They've got the contacts with Nintendo. They understand how to position the games in the store. There's a limited amount of things that I can talk about on Nintendo Switch because of NDAs. My advice would
Right. Yeah.
probably be it's really worthwhile to have your game on as many platforms as possible because it really just multiplies your customer base, it multiplies the revenue. The biggest thing that you can really do to put yourself in a good position for that is developers will typically develop for PC first because it's easier to develop for, and the submission process on Steam, for example, it's very straightforward. But it really pays to pay as much attention as you can to optimization because if you've fundamentally got an optimized game, then it enables you to transfer over to these other platforms so much more easily. And from other developers that I've spoken to that, for example, have access to the developer kits of consoles, often the biggest problem that they face is optimization. Getting the game which might run well on a PC to run well on a PlayStation or an Xbox or a Nintendo Switch. So that that I think if you get the optimization right, then you'll yield benefits in terms of PC and you'll make it more easy to port to consoles as well.
Interesting. Yeah, I didn't think of that being the main kind of challenge, but it makes a lot of sense, especially the way you just described it with the Switch port. Because, yeah, I guess the Switch does not have quite the capabilities of a gaming PC, so that makes a lot of sense.
I think it depends on the game as well. If you've got a game that has a lot of online services and multiplayer, um, that would definitely be more complicated to port over. But if you're looking at a single player game, I think that's really the biggest focus is on optimization. connecting it in with the APIs for the specific platform, I think that that's actually relatively straightforward.
I want to kind of get into kind of the kind of wrap up reflection. You touched on it earlier, some of the learnings that you had, but perhaps you can just kind of give us an overview of some of the things that you I guess wish you had known before you got started, and what you'd like to share with other developers.
I think that talked about it before, the importance of subdividing up the project. I think project management is really important. And initially, I didn't really properly organize everything, didn't have a consistent project management tool to organize everything. About halfway through the project, which I'm kind of embarrassed to say that I did it that late, but about halfway through, I started using Notion, um, which is now a free tool that you can use. It's pretty simple, kind of Kanban um, project management system with a few other features. Um, Basically, using that and just subdividing every task that needed to be done and just keeping track of what needed to be done. That was particularly really useful when working in longer stretches with freelancers because it enabled everything to be tracked more easily. Um, so using the formal project management tools like that, I think is definitely important. Um, in terms of other learnings, I would say the biggest difficulty if you're planning to work with freelancers is what's the cost of everything? Like if you said to someone that didn't have any prior experience that if you wanted to get a logo created or some promo art created, it would really be difficult to imagine how long and how expensive that's going to take. So I guess it's difficult to kind of say this to someone who hasn't developed something before, but well, I guess the learning might be that because there's so many unknowns if you're working on your first project, it probably makes sense to simplify the scope as much as possible. Um, and you might even want to consider something which you can launch comfortably, but maybe as your first title, it's not going to hit all those thresholds that you want. And it might just be something that you can work 6 months on, release it, and then learn from it and continue and create a second title. Um, I felt like I was under pressure just to make the first title a success. And I think maybe if I was to revisit it, I might have released something simpler first and then made the second title bigger. And maybe I could have even done that in the same amount of time. So I would definitely not be afraid to release something first, which is kind of smaller scope, smaller budget, and just try to learn from and do some things right from that.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. As much as, I find it awesome that you kind of jumped into it full time immediately. My personal, experience would be maybe to try and like you said, take 6 months to release something, see how it goes, reevaluate, see if maybe you can kind of speed up the process. So I definitely agree with the feedback you just gave there. I think that's really valuable. Yeah, like I want to talk about kind of, you mentioned that you're already working on your next game. Do you want to share something about that? Or maybe also where people can find you, just so people can figure out what's next for you and follow you on your social media or wherever you want them to hit you up.
I guess the simplest thing is probably to, well, if you go into Frontline Zed on Steam, I guess it's a platform that basically everyone can access. You can follow Frontline Zed. There's a button to follow it there, and I'll post any updates to the game or to a second title there. Otherwise, on Twitter as well, you can follow me under Richard East. I often post not just things about what I'm working on, but also general analysis on the industry. Each week, I update a big spreadsheet that tracks every game launching on Steam, which has proven to be really useful for a lot of other developers. Um, so
Oh wow, yeah,
you can track
that's awesome.
you can track me through on there. In terms of the next title that I'm looking at the beginning of the interview, I talked about the first idea that I had which was this strategy game set in World War II, and I suppose also the learning from Frontline Z. I guess it's kind of the interesting thing because we talked about the learning from a development perspective, but I think there's also a big learning from a kind of market perspective as well. Um, and really, what I realized is that you want to give players basically the ability to create their own content. Um, because there's always a limit to what you can create as an individual or as a small team. But when your game is being played by tens of thousands of people, that's just a huge number of individuals who can create their own worlds. Like, for example, we know any of the kind of procedurally generated games or sandbox games where you kind of present and create the foundation for the player, and then you let their abilities and their imagination and their strategies and their interests take the game in their own direction. So that's what I have planned for the next title. It's not announced yet. I do plan to put it onto Kickstarter, probably at the beginning of next year. Basically, where the player is creating their own vehicles and their own factories, and then deploying those things into a World War environment. So that could probably summarize up the main themes of it so far. But yeah, it's definitely a big learning from giving players the foundations to create their own gameplay from, and allowing each individual to have more of an individual experience. Then that means people can play, that you might get 10 or 20 hours worth of gameplay out of that just by designing it in that certain way, compared to a more linear experience like Frontline Zed, where your gameplay is typically about 3 hours long.
Yeah, I think that having players just create their own content is just such a great way to increase retention, because your days, you have only so many hours in a day. So, you can't always be creating new content, but by making it possible for players to create their own content, you're kind of giving it that infinite lifetime, theoretically infinite, depending on how big the game gets. But yeah, thanks so much for sharing all of that. Good luck with your upcoming project, and thanks so much for sharing all that information on this show.
No worries. Happy to speak to you.
Thanks for listening to the show, guys. I hope you enjoyed it, and join me for next week's by subscribing on whatever platform you're listening to. Richard was kind enough to give me a couple of free copies of his game to give away, so that's what I'll be doing. So to participate in the raffle for the giveaway to win 2 copies of Frontline Zed, all you gotta do is subscribe to the Moonlight Game Devs newsletter. So that newsletter is gonna contain weekly free game assets, the industry breakdown of sort of the most relevant news for game developers, all the sort of educational content that I find and consider to be interesting, and of course sort of the podcast and other news surrounding that. So it's definitely worth subscribing anyway, but you can win a free game. So definitely do that if you haven't checked it out already. Thanks, and I'll catch you for the next episode.